The small town of Senoi, Iowa, basked in the golden glow of a bright day. The picturesque church stood tall, its steeple stretching for the heavens. Inside, rows of pews were filled with smiling faces and whispered excitement. At the altar stood TJ, his grin crooked with sardonic charm, dressed in a slightly wrinkled suit that he had argued added character. Across from him, Lily, radiant and seemingly perfect, glowed with happiness as she spoke her vows with a voice trembling with sincerity. I promise to love you, TJ, with all that I am, to stand by your side through all of life's challenges. You gave me hope when I had none, and I vow to return that light to you every day of our lives, she said, her words steeped in earnest emotion. Her hands trembled slightly as she held his, her gaze unwavering. TJ shifted slightly, his discomfort with such raw sentiment barely concealed. A grin tugged at his lips as he leaned forward, muttering just loud enough for Lily to hear, "Is it too late to switch to I promise not to nag?" Lily's soft laugh broke the tension, and she shook her head at him, her cheeks flushing. The crowd chuckled lightly at TJ's antics, their warmth evident in the murmurs of approval. The priest concluded his blessing with a solemn yet joyful tone. You may now kiss the bride. As TJ leaned in to kiss Lily, the applause rose to a crescendo. Yet, as their lips met, TJ felt an odd ripple in the air, as though something unseen brushed against him. The room darkened briefly, as if a cloud had passed overhead. He instinctively pulled back, his brows furrowing as he glanced toward the crowd, though everyone else seemed oblivious. Cool, TJ muttered under his breath as they turned to face the crowd. Haunted vows. Lily gave his hand a squeeze, her thumb brushing against his palm in a reassuring gesture. You're not funny. Sure I am, TJ replied, masking the slight chill running down his spine with humor. That's why you married me. The churchyard was alive with celebration as the newlyweds stepped into the sunlight. Folding tables decorated with flowers and lace held trays of hors d'oeuvres, glasses of sparkling cider, and a tiered wedding cake that Lily had insisted on baking herself. Guests mingled beneath strings of fairy lights, the soft hum of laughter and conversation weaving through the air. Children darted between the adults, their giggles blending into the distant chirping of birds. TJ found himself cornered by his best friend, Mike, who held a paper plate stacked with finger sandwiches and cheese cubes. You actually went through with it, Mike said, shaking his head with mock disbelief. I half expected you to fake a heart attack at the altar. I considered it, TJ replied, plucking a cube of cheddar from Mike's plate. But I figured, why ruin Lily's big day? She's already locked into the poor life choice of marrying me. Poor life choice? You're a catch, Mike said, smirking. A slightly damaged catch with questionable fashion sense. But a catch nonetheless. TJ snorted. Thanks, man. I'll make sure that's engraved on my tombstone. The two men stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the crowd. Lily moved gracefully through the throng of guests, her laughter ringing out as she hugged family members and old friends. She looked radiant, her white dress catching the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. She looks happy, Mike said softly, nudging TJ with his elbow. You did good, man. TJ's grin faltered slightly as he watched her. Yeah, he said after a pause. She does. Mike studied him, his brow furrowing. What's that tone? You're happy, right? TJ forced a smile, running a hand through his hair. Of course. Happiest I've ever been. As the evening progressed, the celebration showed no signs of slowing. Lily's father, a jovial man with a booming laugh, raised a toast to the couple. To TJ and Lily, he declared, holding his glass aloft. May your life together be as sweet as this cake, as strong as this cider, and as unforgettable as this day. The crowd erupted into cheers, and TJ lifted his glass with a lopsided grin. But as he sipped, his eyes drifted toward the tall church windows. The reflection of the string lights shimmered in the glass, casting strange shapes that seemed to shift and writhe. Everything okay? Lily asked, appearing at his side. TJ blinked, tearing his gaze away from the windows. Yeah, just tired. Big day and all. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "It's the start of forever," she said softly. "And it's perfect." As the last of the guests departed, the churchyard grew quiet. TJ and Lily walked hand in hand back toward the church to collect their belongings. The warm glow of the day had faded into twilight, the air now cool and still. "It really was a perfect day," Lily said, her voice dreamy. "Don't you think?" "Perfect," TJ echoed, though a faint unease gnawed at the back of his mind. He glanced over his shoulder at the darkened windows of the church. For a brief moment he thought he saw movement, a shadow flitting across the glass. He froze, his grip on Lily's hand tightening. "Something wrong?" she asked, turning to follow his gaze. He shook his head quickly. "No, just, this day's been a lot." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Let's go home," she said. "Our forever starts now." The newlyweds moved into their farmhouse later that afternoon. The building was imposing. With an aged charm that hinted at decades of stories, it kept locked within its walls. Surrounding the property were endless fields, their golden hues stark against the vivid blue sky. The cicadas hummed incessantly, a background noise that seemed to amplify the oppressive quiet of the house. "This place has potential," TJ said, struggling to lift a heavy box through the threshold. "Just needs a little work. Duct tape here, maybe a seance there. The usual." "It's perfect," Lily said with a smile, her voice warm with optimism. She set a smaller box down on the dusty floor. A fresh start. The interior of the farmhouse was as charming as it was eerie. High ceilings with exposed wooden beams cast long shadows as the evening sun filtered through the windows. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of old wood and disuse. As they began unpacking, TJ noticed subtle oddities in the house. A draft brushed past him in the hallway, though no windows were open. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet, and he swore he heard faint whispers when he stood still for too long. "Did you hear that?" he asked Lily as they worked together in the kitchen. "Hear what?" she replied, her tone dismissive. "Nothing. Probably just the house settling." TJ forced a laugh, but his unease lingered. They explored the rest of the house, room by room. Each space told a story of neglect and abandonment. The furniture left behind by the previous owners was covered in dust, and the walls bore faint marks of water damage. One room, however, caught TJ's attention. It was a small, windowless space at the end of the hallway. The door was locked. "That's weird," TJ said, jiggling the doorknob. "Why would someone lock a room in their own house?" "Maybe they kept something valuable in there," Lily suggested, already losing interest. "Or maybe it's where they kept their haunted dolls," TJ muttered, peering through the keyhole. The darkness inside offered no answers. "Come on," Lily called from the living room. "We have plenty of unpacking to do." Reluctantly, TJ left the locked door behind, but the thought of what lay inside gnawed at him. The first night in the farmhouse was anything but restful. TJ lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the sounds of the house seemed to grow louder in the darkness. The creaks of the floorboards, the faint rustling in the walls, and the low hum of the cicadas outside formed a cacophony that refused to be ignored. Beside him, Lily slept peacefully, her breathing soft and even. TJ envied her ability to drift off so easily. Just as he began to close his eyes, a faint whisper reached his ears. "TJ." He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The room was still. He glanced around, his eyes darting to every corner. "Lily, did you say something?" She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Swallowing hard, TJ swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood. The wooden floor was cold against his feet as he made his way to the hallway. The whisper came again, faint but distinct. "TJ." He followed the sound to the locked door at the end of the hall. The air around it felt colder, and a faint draft seemed to seep through the cracks. He pressed his ear to the door, his breath shallow. Nothing. Shaking his head, TJ returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The whispers stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind. The following day, TJ decided to investigate the history of the house. He visited the local library hoping to find answers. The librarian, a kind but reserved woman named Mrs. Adler, listened attentively as TJ explained his interest. "This house has been around for decades," Mrs. Adler said, pulling out a thick binder of records. "Seen its fair share of owners. Some stayed longer than others." TJ flipped through the pages, his unease growing as he read about the house's past. Stories of unexplained disappearances, tragic accidents, and whispers of hauntings filled the records. One photograph caught his eye, the farmhouse as it appeared 50 years ago. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, its features obscured. "That's unsettling," TJ muttered. Mrs. Adler gave him a pointed look. "If you want my advice, you'll leave that house. Some places are better left alone." TJ left the library with more questions than answers. As he drove back to the farmhouse, the sense of unease deepened. Something about the house didn't feel right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Back at the house, Lily greeted him with a smile. "How was your trip to town?" "Informative," TJ said, forcing a smile. "This place has a colorful history." "Don't overthink it," Lily said, wrapping her arms around him. "It's just a house." But TJ wasn't convinced. That night, as he lay awake once more, the whispers returned. And this time they sounded closer. The third day in the farmhouse brought more strange occurrences. TJ found a pile of dead flies on the windowsill in the living room, their tiny bodies forming an unsettling pattern. When he mentioned it to Lily, she shrugged. "It's an old house, probably nothing," but TJ wasn't so sure. He couldn't ignore the faint scratch marks that appeared on the walls in the hallway, or the way the air seemed heavier near the locked room. Desperate for answers, he called his friend Mike. "Mike, you've got to come see this place," TJ said over the phone. "Something's off." "Off how?" Mike asked, his tone skeptical. "It's hard to explain, but I feel like I'm not alone here." "TJ, it's an old farmhouse. They creak, they groan. There's probably nothing." But even as Mike dismissed his concerns, TJ couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him. That night, TJ awoke to the sound of footsteps. He sat up in bed, his heart racing. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone pacing in the hallway. He glanced at Lily, who was still fast asleep. Grabbing a flashlight, TJ crept out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. TJ shone the flashlight down the corridor, the beam illuminating the locked door at the end. The doorknob rattled. TJ froze, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he considered waking Lily, but something told him she wouldn't hear what he was hearing. Summoning his courage, he approached the door. The rattling stopped as he drew near. "Who's there?" TJ whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no answer. He reached out and touched the doorknob. It was ice cold. That night he couldn't sleep. Something was in the house, and it wasn't leaving. The following morning, TJ decided he needed to get into the locked room. He rummaged through the garage, searching for tools, and eventually found an old crowbar. With Lily busy tending to the garden, TJ returned to the hallway and wedged the crowbar into the doorframe. The door groaned in protest before finally giving way. The room beyond was dark and stifling, the air thick with dust. TJ stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with old books, jars of strange substances, and faded photographs. In the center of the room sat a table. On it was a leather-bound journal and a small box. TJ opened the box first, revealing a collection of trinkets, rings, necklaces, and coins, all inscribed with the same symbol as the medallion he had found. He turned his attention to the journal. The pages were brittle, but the handwriting was clear. It belonged to a man named Elias Harper, who had lived in the house over a century ago. The entries grew darker as TJ read on, detailing Elias's descent into paranoia and fear. The whispers grow louder each night. One entry read, "She watches me, even when she's not there." The final entry sent a chill down TJ's spine. "I've sealed the room, but it won't stop her. Nothing will." TJ left the room in a daze, clutching the journal. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt the air shift, colder than before. The faint sound of laughter echoed from somewhere deep within the house. "Lily," he called out, but there was no response. His grip tightened on the journal as a shadow darted across the far wall. For the first time since moving in, TJ realized he wasn't just imagining things. Something was here and it was watching. His heart raced as the laughter echoed again, this time louder, as if mocking his every move. He turned sharply, the journal slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Shadows seemed to ripple along the walls, converging and dispersing like living things. The cold silence that followed was suffocating. TJ backed away from the locked room, shutting the door behind him, but he knew it wouldn't stop whatever was lurking in the house. Clutching the journal to his chest, he resolved to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As he stepped into the living room, Lily appeared at the edge of the hallway, her expression calm yet unreadable. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, her voice carrying an unsettling undertone. TJ hesitated before answering. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady but his eyes fixed on hers. "Just some old things." But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of a far darker mystery. The farmhouse stood silent, shrouded in an unnatural stillness, as TJ sat in the living room clutching the leather-bound journal he had found. The air felt heavy, charged with a tension he couldn't name. Across the room, Lily hummed softly, busying herself with tidying up the kitchen. Her calm demeanor only amplified TJ's unease. He flipped through the brittle pages again, his eyes skimming over the erratic scrawls of Elias Harper, a man who had lived in the house over a century ago. Elias wrote of strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, and a figure he could never quite see but always felt watching him. "What's that?" Lily's voice broke through TJ's thoughts. He startled, slamming the journal shut. "Just some old junk I found," he said, slipping the book behind him. "Figured it might be interesting." Lily tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You've been acting strange since we moved in." TJ forced a smile. "It's the house. You know me, big city guy stuck in a creaky old farmhouse. I'm probably just imagining things." She stared at him for a moment longer before turning back to the sink. TJ exhaled, relief mingling with the gnawing sense that she didn't entirely believe him. The next morning, TJ returned to the local library. Mrs. Adler greeted him with a knowing look as he approached her desk. "Back again?" she asked, her tone laced with curiosity. "Yeah," TJ said, placing the journal on the counter. "This belonged to someone who used to live in the house. Elias Harper. Do you know anything about him?" Mrs. Adler's eyes widened as she examined the journal. "Elias Harper," she murmured. "He was one of the first owners. The stories about him, well, they're not for the faint of heart." TJ leaned in. "What kind of stories?" Mrs. Adler hesitated, then gestured for him to follow her to a back room. The dimly lit space smelled of old paper and mildew. She pulled a dusty file from a cabinet and spread its contents on a nearby table. Newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and handwritten notes painted a grim picture. "Elias Harper was a farmer," Mrs. Adler began. "He moved here with his wife, Lillian. At first, everything seemed fine, but after a few years, neighbors noticed he had become reclusive. He stopped attending church, rarely came to town. Then his wife disappeared." "Disappeared?" TJ asked, his pulse quickening. Mrs. Adler nodded. "He claimed she left him, but no one ever saw her again." Shortly after, Elias started talking about things in the house. Whispers, shadows. People thought he was losing his mind. TJ flipped through the clippings, stopping at one with a photograph of Elias standing in front of the farmhouse. Beside him was a woman with piercing eyes and a serene smile. "Is this Lillian?" Mrs. Adler glanced at the photo and nodded. "That's her." TJ's chest tightened. The resemblance to Lily was uncanny. That night, TJ couldn't sleep. The journal sat on the nightstand, its presence a reminder of the questions he couldn't shake. Beside him, Lily slept soundly, her breathing soft and even. TJ envied her serenity. Around midnight, the whispers began again. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. He scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. TJ. The sound was closer this time, almost as if it were inside the room. Swallowing hard, TJ grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and crept out of bed. He followed the sound to the hallway, his steps slow and deliberate. The locked room at the end of the hall seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't explain. As he approached, the whispers stopped. The air grew colder, and a shadow darted across the crack beneath the door. TJ froze, his breath hitching. Summoning his courage, he reached for the doorknob. It didn't rattle this time, but it was colder than ice. "What's in there?" he whispered to himself. The silence that followed was deafening. The following day, TJ called Mike. "You need to come over," he said, his voice tense. "TJ, what's going on?" Mike asked, concern lacing his tone. "I can't explain it over the phone. Just, please. I need someone to see this place." Mike hesitated but eventually agreed. "I'll be there tomorrow." Feeling a small measure of relief, TJ decided to spend the day digging deeper into Elias Harper's life. He returned to the room where he had first found the journal. Among the boxes of old belongings, he discovered more photographs and letters. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, caught his attention. "To whoever finds this," it began, "you must leave this house. She is not what she seems. She will not let you go." The letter ended abruptly. The ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. TJ's hands trembled as he placed the letter back in the box. He had hoped for answers, but all he found were more questions. When Mike arrived the next morning, TJ wasted no time showing him the journal, the photographs, and the letter. Mike listened intently, his usual skepticism replaced by genuine concern. "This is a lot," Mike admitted. "But are you sure you're not just overthinking things? Old houses are creepy. They make noises." TJ shook his head. "It's not just the noises. It's the whispers, the locked room, the way Lily's been acting." "What do you mean?" "She's different," TJ said. "She shrugs everything off like it's nothing. But sometimes I catch her staring at me, like she's waiting for something." Mike frowned. "Have you talked to her about this?" "She won't listen," TJ said, his frustration boiling over. "She loves this house. She thinks I'm being paranoid." Mike placed a hand on TJ's shoulder. "All right, let's take a look at this locked room." The two men stood in front of the door, the crowbar TJ had used to break it open resting against the wall. The room beyond was as TJ had left it, dusty, cluttered, and filled with relics of the past. "This is it," TJ said, gesturing to the shelves and the table. "This is where I found the journal." Mike walked around the room, his eyes scanning the shelves. "These symbols," he said, pointing to the trinkets, "they look familiar." "Familiar how?" TJ asked. Mike hesitated. "I've seen them in books about folklore. They're usually associated with protection or curses." TJ's stomach sank. "So which is it? Protection or curse?" "I don't know," Mike admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not good." As they spoke, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and writhe, forming shapes that made TJ's blood run cold. "We need to leave," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. TJ nodded, but as they turned to go, the door slammed shut. The sound reverberated through the room, shaking the shelves and sending a jar crashing to the floor. The two men froze, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "Did you see that?" TJ whispered. Mike nodded, his face pale. "We're not alone." When they finally managed to leave the room, TJ and Mike sat in the living room, their nerves frayed. Lily entered, her expression calm yet curious. "What's going on?" she asked, her gaze flicking between the two men. "Nothing," TJ said quickly. "Just catching up." Lily raised an eyebrow but said nothing. As she walked away, Mike leaned closer to TJ. "You need to get out of here," he said. "This house isn't safe." "I can't," TJ said. "Not without Lily." Mike sighed. "Then you need to figure out what's really going on before it's too late." That night, TJ sat alone in the living room, the journal open on his lap. The words of Elias Harper echoed in his mind. She is not what she seems. She will not let you go. The faint sound of laughter drifted through the house, its tone cold and mocking. It seemed to echo from every corner, growing louder with each passing second. TJ snapped the journal shut, his hands trembling, as he forced himself to stand. This house wasn't just haunted by memories. It was alive, and it wanted something from him. As the laughter faded into an oppressive silence, TJ turned to the hallway. Shadows flickered unnaturally, and he could feel the house watching, waiting. Clutching the journal tightly, he resolved to find out what had happened to Elias Harper and his wife, Lillian. But more than that, he needed to uncover the truth about Lily. As her voice called softly from the kitchen, "TJ, are you all right?" He hesitated, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure anymore if she was his salvation or part of the darkness threatening to consume him. TJ didn't sleep the night after his discovery. The journal's frantic scrawls and the cryptic letter haunted his thoughts, their implications burrowing into his mind like splinters. The words, "She is not what she seems," replayed over and over as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the medallion and the photograph of Elias Harper and Lillian. The resemblance between Lillian and Lily was undeniable, a puzzle piece that didn't fit but couldn't be ignored. By morning, TJ had resolved to take Mrs. Adler's advice and seek out Professor Lewis in Cedar Rapids. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time, and the house's oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Lily didn't question his sudden need to leave, simply kissing him goodbye as he climbed into the car. Her calm acceptance unnerved him. It was as if she already knew where he was going. Professor Lewis's office was exactly what TJ expected. Cluttered, dimly lit, and filled with the smell of aged paper and incense. The professor himself was a wiry man with silver-rimmed glasses and an intense gaze that seemed to see straight through TJ. "You must be Mr. Carver," Lewis said, gesturing for him to sit. Mrs. Adler called ahead. She said, "You have something unusual." TJ placed the journal, the medallion, and the photograph on the desk. "I need to know what these mean," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Lewis studied the items in silence, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the journal. When he reached the final entry, he set the book down and adjusted his glasses. "This is troubling." "No kidding," TJ muttered. "Who was Elias Harper? And why does his wife look exactly like mine?" Lewis leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Elias Harper was a farmer, yes, but also a recluse in his later years. The stories about him are grim. Whispers of madness, occult practices, and a wife who vanished under mysterious circumstances. But what you're dealing with, he tapped the medallion. This symbol is ancient, tied to folklore about Lilith. Lilith? TJ repeated, the name unfamiliar. "The first wife of Adam," Lewis explained. "A demon cast out of Eden, said to prey on men and children. In some stories, she's described as a seductress, in others as a vengeful spirit. Always, though, she's eternal." TJ's stomach turned. "Are you saying Lily is... what? Possessed? A reincarnation?" Lewis hesitated. "I'm saying she may not be what she seems. If this house has drawn her here, it's not by coincidence. Lilith thrives on despair, on those who cling to their grief." "That's insane," TJ said, though the words rang hollow. He thought of Lily's distant stares, her eerie calm, and the way the house seemed to bend around her presence. "You came to me for answers," Lewis said sharply. "If you want my advice, leave. Burn the house if you must, but do not stay." TJ sat in stunned silence. "And Lily?" Lewis's gaze softened. "If she's tied to this, then she won't leave willingly." The drive back to the farmhouse was suffocating. Every mile felt heavier, the weight of the professor's words pressing down on TJ's chest. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house loomed in shadow, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Lily greeted him at the door with her usual smile. "How was your trip?" "Informative," TJ said, forcing a neutral tone. "I found some things that might help," She tilted her head, studying him. You've been so tense lately. Why don't we sit down, have some tea? Maybe later, TJ said, brushing past her. He needed time to think, to figure out his next move. But as he climbed the stairs to their bedroom, he felt her gaze lingering on his back, heavier than ever. That night, TJ didn't dare sleep. He sat in the living room, the medallion clutched in one hand and the journal open on the coffee table. The shadows seemed to stretch and crawl along the walls, and the whispers were louder than ever, an incessant chorus that gnawed at his sanity. "Why are you here?" he muttered under his breath. "What do you want?" The room answered with silence, but a faint laugh echoed from the hallway. TJ stood, his muscles taut, and turned toward the sound. The hallway was empty, but the door to the locked room was ajar. He approached cautiously, the medallion feeling heavier in his hand. Pushing the door open, he found the room exactly as he had left it. Dusty shelves, jars of strange substances, and the table with the small box. But this time there was something else. In the center of the room, a faint figure flickered, its form hazy and indistinct. "Lillian?" TJ whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging him. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. The next morning, TJ confronted Lily. He waited until they were seated at the kitchen table, the journal and medallion between them. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. Lily looked up from her tea, her expression calm. "About what?" "About the house. About you," TJ said. "This isn't normal, Lily. The whispers, the locked room, the things I've found. And then there's this." He pointed to the photograph of Lillian. She studied the image for a long moment before meeting his gaze. "You think I'm her?" "I don't know what to think," TJ admitted. "But something is wrong here, and I need you to be honest with me." Lily sighed, setting her cup down. "TJ, I love you, but you've been spiraling since we moved here. Maybe this house isn't the problem. Maybe it's you." Her words stung, but TJ refused to back down. "I'm not imagining this. I spoke to a professor who said—" "A professor?" Lily interrupted, her voice rising. "You've been running around talking to strangers about our lives instead of coming to me?" TJ slammed his hand on the table, the medallion clinking against the wood. "Because I don't know if I can trust you." The silence that followed was deafening. Lily's expression hardened, her serene facade cracking. Without a word, she stood and walked out of the room, leaving TJ alone with his doubts. That evening, TJ received a text from Mike. "Call me when you can. Found something you'll want to see." He dialed immediately, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "I was digging through some old archives," Mike said. "There are more stories about your house. It's not just Elias and Lillian. There's a pattern. Every couple that's lived there, something's happened to them. Disappearances, deaths, madness." TJ's grip tightened on the phone. "And the wives?" "Always the same description," Mike said. "Dark hair, pale skin, piercing eyes." "TJ, it's Lily." The call ended abruptly as the lights in the house flickered. TJ turned slowly, the phone slipping from his grasp. Lily stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light. "Who were you talking to?" she asked, her voice low. "No one," TJ lied, his pulse racing. "Just a work call." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You've been so distracted lately. You should rest." As she left, TJ sank into a chair, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here, but he couldn't leave without answers. That night, TJ packed a bag. He didn't know where he would go, but he needed to get out. As he descended the stairs, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to come from all around him, overlapping and incomprehensible. When he reached the front door, Lily was waiting for him. Her calm smile sent a chill down his spine. "Going somewhere?" she asked. "I need some air," TJ said, his voice shaking. She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "You're not leaving, TJ." "Not yet." For the first time, TJ saw something in her gaze that wasn't human. He took a step back, his hand tightening around the medallion. "What are you?" Her smile widened. You'll find out soon enough. The house seemed to come alive around him, the walls groaning and the shadows growing darker. As TJ bolted for the back door, Lily's laughter echoed behind him, cold and mocking. He didn't stop running until he was in the middle of the field, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the night sky. He clutched the medallion to his chest, his breath ragged. He wasn't safe, not yet. But he knew one thing for certain: he had to end this. Whatever Lily was, whatever the house wanted, he wouldn't let it take him. The next morning, TJ returned to the farmhouse with a plan. He carried a can of gasoline, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding. He could feel it watching him, waiting. As he approached the front door, Lily appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You came back," she said, her voice echoing with a resonance that wasn't hers. "I'm ending this," TJ said, his voice firm. "Whatever you are, whatever this house is, it's over." Lily's smile widened, her form shifting and distorting as shadows swirled around her. "You can't destroy me, TJ. I've been here for centuries. I'll always be here." TJ stepped forward, the gasoline sloshing in the can. "Maybe, but you won't take anyone else." He doused the porch and the walls, the acrid smell of gasoline filling the air. Lily's laughter grew louder, more manic, as the shadows around her thickened. TJ struck a match and tossed it onto the porch. Flames erupted, spreading quickly as the old wood caught fire. Lily's form dissolved into the shadows, her laughter echoing through the flames. TJ backed away, his heart pounding as the fire consumed the house. The screams of the house, or perhaps Lily, filled the air, a cacophony of rage and despair. As the farmhouse burned, TJ felt a weight lift from his chest. The whispers stopped, the shadows receded, and the oppressive atmosphere dissipated. He stood in the field, watching the flames, until the house was nothing but ash and smoke. When the fire finally died down, TJ turned and walked away. He didn't look back. The medallion in his pocket felt lighter, as if the curse had been lifted. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was free. And so, the legend of the farmhouse and the shadows that knew her name faded into memory. But for TJ, the scars of that night would remain, a reminder of the darkness he had faced and the strength it took to walk away.